Welcome to CMMC Unacknowledged, where we ask our resident expert some of the unanswered questions that were asked during last month's CMMC-AB Townhall meeting. My name is Todd Stanton. I'm the Regional Sales Manager for all things CMMC at Etactics. And I'm joined by the Senior Information Assurance Manager at Rain Associates, Ty Wittenberg. Welcome, Ty.
Hey, Todd, thank you so much for having me, and Happy New Year.
Thank you. I'm looking forward to our conversation today. All right, our question for this episode, Ty, is does the CMMC Level 2 scoping guide clarify for you whether or not external service providers, or ESPs, would be considered within the scope of an assessment for an OSC?
So I believe it does. I think it provides some clarity that CMMC 1.0 didn't. They call it an ESP here. In my world and in your world, we would call it a MSP, right? A managed service provider.
Or a CSP, cloud service provider.
Service provider, yeah. So, yes, I think it brings some clarity specifically around what systems they touch, germane to CUI, and specific to the security assets, the security protection assets. I think it also brings some clarity around, how those folks interact with it on their side. It almost likens to me the expectation from HIPAA with a BAA, right? The Business Associates Agreement, that they are adhering to the regulations as well, too.
So if these external service providers are within scope, does that mean that all 110 practices of NIST 800-171 are applicable to them as well?
Applicable to the systems and roles that would interact with the client's environment, most definitely.
And does that include their people and their facilities in addition to their technology?
It would. So people, facilities, capabilities, log in, or log in and log out. Does that support staff get to work outside of their own facility and work remotely? So you open up, in my opinion, your policies and procedures, your system security plans, your disaster recovery, incident response, to be interrogated under the CMMC model.
And so I'm going to go back to something you said on a previous episode where we talked about the question was, could you use policies and procedures to really limit a security protection asset, which an ESP would be considered, to a contractor risk managed asset? So I'd like to explore that maybe a little bit more detail here. They mentioned when talking about ESPs in the Level 2 scoping guide to look at the contracts in place with those vendors. So is that where you see the potential to maybe mitigate some of that exposure and really reduce the scope of what they're able to touch using contracts?
I think through contracts, yes, is the first, and clearly defining scope and responsibilities and what they're doing and in what particular times and what personnel are touching those systems. Because, depending on to put it in a help desk aspect, depending on the tier 1 or tier 2 support access that they might be providing, depending on your provider, you might, if you know that there's controlled and classified in the environment, you might, when those particular tickets come in, they might get routed in a totally different way than the rest of the organization.
Okay, perfect. So now I'm going to kind of make an assumption here based on some of the things that I've read, and it goes back to FedRAMP and equivalency. So if you were to read the DFARS 252, 204, 7012, it discusses the use of CSPs, cloud service providers, which would be an ESP here, and it references FedRAMP moderate equivalency. But the scoping guide, the CMMC scoping guide, doesn't really provide any guidance on reciprocity with FedRAMP. So does reciprocity or equivalency exist under the current CMMC guidance for ESPs?
There's some notes to it in the guide around using it as a baseline. there is not officially a reciprocity. So I think the first issue there is that there's an assumption that, either having a FedRAMP moderate or high will eventually mean reciprocity with CMMC. I don't know what those talks look like with the Department of Defense and with the CMMC-AB. So would it be a good thing potentially? I believe yes. Is that going to happen? I don't know. So, there is not a formal reciprocity, but there is guidance in there that if they do have those controls in place, I think that puts you on a better standing as you're going through the CMMC assessment than if, that organization did not have that FedRAMP certification. Did that answer your question?
It did, and I'm gonna just give you one scenario that I read on LinkedIn just last week, where it talked about an authorized C3PAO, so a certified third-party organization that has gone through a DIPCAC assessment, and they were using a cloud service provider that was not FedRAMP authorized. However, that cloud service provider, being considered within the scope of the assessment for the C3PAO, went out and hired a third party to conduct a FedRAMP assessment and then write a letter stating the outcome of their assessment on the FedRAMP controls, concluded that the CSP was FedRAMP moderate equivalent. And the DIPCAC did accept that as evidence demonstrating equivalency with the FedRAMP framework. So I think that kind of would go to support your argument that you've made, that even though it's not specifically laid out, there is discussions about if it is FedRAMP moderate equivalent. I guess the question in the larger DIB would be, does every organization, is every CSP going to take the same approach that the C3PAO did and have a third party, really conduct that FedRAMP assessment on the CSP and write that letter that says they're equivalent, right? And then the discretion of the assessor at that point to take that evidence and look at that and determine whether or not that CSP is following the guidelines of the DFARS.
Yeah, I think one, for the CSP, that's a business decision, right? Two, what you're talking about, there was a big win for a large cloud provider, Azure, right? That the government originally was giving them under this JETI program, sole access as a cloud provider, and then it was rescinded, and now they're reconsidering other cloud providers out there, like the GCP, the Google Cloud Space, Azure, AWS. So, depending on the relationship that cloud service provider has with the client in that assessment space, if they're willing to go down that path, which my belief is from Fed Scoop articles that I've read, all of them want a piece of that pie. I think a good DIPCAC assessor will take the assessment from a third party, interrogate it under the lens of focus for the CMMC assessment and expectations. And if it meets those expectations through their assessment, then yes, you would be okay. It's a future state. I don't know for sure if it'll ever happen or be formalized in a scoping guide that specifically will provide guidance on defining that. But my opinion and my hope would be that you've got all of these things down there around FedRAMP, CMMC, ITAR, all this stuff, that at some point there'll be some form of unification that provides good clarity amongst all of them and can show not only connectivity, but relevance to having those controls in place to the maturity of the organization's information security program and risk management framework.
Let me ask you this. Is it any easier for a CSP to go through a CMMC assessment and certification effort versus a FedRAMP certification effort?
That's a good question. I think CMMC with the 800-171 and the self-assessment aspect of it, and then the guidance from the scoping levels from the undersecretary. I believe we're in our early stages. I'm not saying that it's a lesser, but FedRAMP has a little bit more maturity than the CMMC does. My personal opinion would be yes, going through a CMMC assessment potentially is a good stepping stone and an easier first step than trying to go through a FedRAMP.
And just doing a quick search here, I wasn't as familiar with the FedRAMP controls, but it looks like there are 325 controls for a FedRAMP moderate versus the 110 that we've talked about for a CMMC level 2. So perhaps it means it's less expensive. I've heard estimates for a FedRAMP authorization package costing north of $100,000 for the assessment. CMMC yet to be determined what the cost is, but I think the estimates from Department of Defense were closer to $30,000 or $50,000 for an assessment. So potentially, it's a little less expensive and maybe a little easier, which kind of leads me into that business discussion that you talked about a few minutes ago. Whether or not these cloud service providers or even software as a service solutions make that business decision to become either FedRAMP authorized or CMMC authorized, so that they could continue working in the defense industrial base. So based on your understanding today of where these ESPs fall within the scope of assessment, and given that they're subject to a full stack CMMC assessment themselves in order for their customers to be compliant, do you feel like there's any risk that if these tool providers decide not to invest in becoming certified because the DIB companies represent maybe a smaller portion of their overall business, that leads to the potential to maybe degrade some of the actual security that may be implemented today in favor of security that's compliant with what the requirements are in CMMC?
Yes and no, right? I think it makes the work for the organization seeking certification at that particular point have to work a little bit harder with sourcing. Obviously, each and every one have to make a decision or a business case around why you need to go through the maturity for the CMMC and what value or importance you are in that supply chain. I will tell you that a lot of these smaller businesses have a lot of value. I think what we're going to find is, as we go through this as well too, the waiver program, which we didn't even talk about this in right now, there might be some waivers involved if these folks can demonstrate their importance in the supply chain and what they have for a solution, and that there might be some negative impact to them, not only from security, but financially by losing their ESP. I think the waiver portion is a game changer, and I think it gives potentially give people some time, right? And some organizations maybe some breath to decide whether they want to continue to go down the path of supporting organizations that do business in the defense industrial base.
And I'll just kind of weigh in with my 2 cents here.
Yeah.
Based on the SolarWinds attack from last year, I think that we've seen the potential for these ESPs that do become impacted by a cybersecurity breach to then expand exponentially to all their customers. And so, I understand the concerns in limiting maybe the number of providers that are willing to go through either a FedRAMP or a CMMC authorization. But I see it as very valuable if we do want to implement the best security controls for the information that's worth protecting, based on just some of the recent experiences that we've seen where these CSPs are compromised, and then by virtue of them being compromised, all their customers are now compromised. So I think protecting that vulnerability through the supply chain is really a really important part of what CMMC should be doing.
I wouldn't disagree with you, right? Maybe I didn't articulate myself very well there, that your ESP can wind up being a single source or a choke point, right? That a threat actor can take advantage of. And the threats out there and loss event frequency that, we talk about with clients from unmitigated issues and vulnerabilities in your systems, so on and so forth. There's this reality that it's imperfect. It's not a matter of if it'll happen, but when it's going to happen. I think any system is potentially vulnerable, and I think Log4j showed that to us because of the wide breadth of how deep that code is. I think if you circle back to it, though, when you talk about these partnerships, whether you be an ESP or an organization seeking certification who partners with an ESP, good supply chain management of those folks working with you in your system, in your journey is critical to the CMMC journey, and really speaks to an organization's maturity. So I think that's what it really uncovers, is that supply chain, third-party assessments, asking those tough questions of your vendors that are doing business with you, and then making business decisions, whether they stay or whether they choose to stay or don't stay, the ESPs that is critical to ensuring the defense industrial base in the CMMC space. Does that make sense?
It does. I completely agree. I think that the requirements are there, that, it's going to be a tough decision for these tool providers and CSPs to determine whether they want to make that investment. But, those that do will be rewarded with, more opportunities within the defense industrial base than those that don't. And I think ultimately, that will provide better security for the DIB, which is, I think, ultimately what we're all trying to accomplish.
Yeah. Look, when I was in the Army, we used to play cards, or we'd play dominoes, and, you play for points, right? And there was always this joke and saying from my fellow soldiers that I served with that were from the Washington, D.C., Baltimore area. They always used to like to say, not all money is good money, right? And so I guess to circle it back to what we're talking about here, folks are going to have to determine for their business model if it makes sense to spend a little bit money, maybe have a bit of a thinner profit margin for a while to continue to grow it. And maybe what we'll find out from this CMMC and this ESP space is that it'll thin out and the cream will rise to the top, and, providers such as Etactics and things like that, or Array and Associates that has a managed security and IT service will rise to the top, and, then we'll become the targets of the threats. But, we'll make sure that we're shored up and we're doing the things to reduce the loss frequency.
Well said. All right, we'll leave it there. Thank you for your thoughts, Ty. It was a lively debate. Appreciate it.
No, great.